The first time Nathaniel Cross saw his own reflection after the fire, he put his fist through the mirror. That was 11 years ago, in the small township of Millbrook Hollow, Montana, and the scars that climbed from his jaw to his left ear, twisting the corner of his mouth into a permanent, crooked line, had never once let him forget the night his father's forge collapsed in flames around him. The town said many things about Nathaniel Cross. They said he was the strongest blacksmith in 3 counties, that his hands could bend iron like it was clay, that no will he repaired ever failed and no horseshoe he forged ever cracked. But mostly they said no woman would ever wed him. They said it in the general store when they thought he couldn't hear. They said it at church socials behind gloved hands and lace fans. They said it so often, for so many years, that Nathaniel himself had come to believe it was simply a fact of his life, as fixed and unchangeable as the scars themselves. And then, on a gray October morning in 1887, a letter arrived at the Millbrook Hollow post office that would prove every single one of them wrong. If you believe in second chances, if you believe that kindness can outshine a scar, that love can see past what the eyes first notice, then stay with me for this story. And before you go any further, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's step back into that October morning, and into the life of a man the whole town had already given up on. Nathaniel Cross was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, and quiet in the way that men become quiet when they have learned that silence hurts less than being stared at. He had built his forge with his own hands after his father passed, rebuilding it plank by plank on the very ground where the old one had burned down around him when he was 23. The fire had taken his father's life, had taken half of Nathaniel's face, and had taken, he believed, any chance he might have had at an ordinary life. He worked from sunrise until the light gave out, shoeing horses, mending plows, forging nails and hinges and the 1,000 small iron things a frontier town needed to survive. He was respected. Men shook his hand and trusted his word. But respect was not the same as belonging, and Nathaniel had spent over a decade watching other men court and marry and raise children while he ate his supper alone at a scarred wooden table in the room above his shop. It was his sister, Martha Whitfield, who finally pushed him toward the newspaper advertisement. Martha lived 2 towns over with her husband and 3 children, and she had watched her brother harden year after year into something quieter and lonelier than she could bear. She had heard of other men in the territory writing to matrimonial agencies back east, women willing to travel across half a continent for the promise of a homestead and a husband. Nathaniel had laughed the first time she brought it up, a short, humorless sound, and told her that no woman reading a letter would want to marry a man once she saw his face. Martha had looked at him with the kind of steady patience only a sister can have and told him that any woman worth marrying would want to know his heart before she ever needed to see his face, and that if he never gave anyone the chance, he would spend the rest of his life proving the town right instead of proving them wrong. He wrote the letter on a night in late September, by lamplight, after the shop had gone quiet. He tore up 3 drafts before he let himself write the truth. He did not hide what had happened to him. He wrote that he was a blacksmith, steady in trade and sober in habit, that he owned his shop and a small house behind it, that he could offer security but not the smooth, easy face the town's other men could offer. He wrote that a fire had scarred him badly enough that children sometimes cried at the sight of him, and that he would understand completely if the woman reading his words wished to set the letter aside and choose someone else. He sealed it before he could change his mind and sent it to the agency in Boston that Martha had found, expecting, if he was honest with himself, nothing at all. 3 weeks later a reply came. It was written in a careful, looping hand, and it belonged to a young woman named Sarah Whitmore, 26 years old, of a small coastal town in Maine. Sarah had grown up the daughter of a fisherman who had drowned when she was 19, and she had spent the years since caring for a mother whose health had been failing quietly, like a candle burning down in a house with no more candles to replace it. Her mother had passed the previous spring, and Sarah had found herself, for the first time in her life, entirely alone, with no family left along that rocky coast and no prospects that did not involve becoming a burden on relatives who had made it clear, in the careful way people do, that they had burdens enough of their own. She had answered 3 advertisements before Nathaniel's. The other two men had described their farms and their fortunes and had said almost nothing of themselves. Nathaniel's letter was different. It was honest in a way that unsettled her and moved her at the same time, and she wrote back that very night. She told him that a scar on a man's face had never yet told her anything true about the man underneath it, and that she would rather marry someone who told her the hard truth up front than someone who dressed up a lie in fine words. She said she was willing to travel to Montana, sight unseen, if he was willing to have her. They exchanged 4 more letters over the following month, and with each one, something in Nathaniel that had been clenched shut for 11 years began, very slowly, to loosen. Sarah wrote about the smell of salt air and the sound of gulls, about her mother's hands, about the particular ache of watching someone you love fade a little more each week. Nathaniel wrote about the forge, about the rhythm of hammer on iron that had kept him sane through the worst years, about the strange peace of watching raw metal take a useful shape under patient hands. Neither of them wrote about love, because it seemed too large a word for letters between strangers. But there was a tenderness building in the space between their sentences that both of them could feel and neither of them named. When the day finally came for Sarah's train to arrive, the whole of Millbrook Hollow seemed to know about it, the way small towns always know everything. Nathaniel stood on the platform in his one good coat, freshly shaved. His scarred cheek turned slightly away from the crowd the way it had turned away from crowds for 11 years out of habit rather than hope. Around him, other townsfolk had gathered on the pretense of waiting for the mail or meeting the same train. But everyone understood why they were really there. He heard the whispers before the train even pulled in. He heard old Mrs. Pemberton mutter to her neighbor that the poor girl was in for a shock, and he heard someone else wonder aloud whether she would simply refuse to get off the train once she caught sight of him waiting there. He had heard variations of these words for over a decade, and still, standing on that platform with his heart hammering harder than it ever had at the forge, they cut freshly, deeply, right down to the bone. The train arrived in a cloud of steam and noise, and for a long moment, no one stepped down from the passenger car, and Nathaniel felt something cold settle into his stomach, a certainty that she had seen him through the window and changed her mind. Then a young woman appeared in the doorway, holding a single worn traveling case, wearing a plain blue dress that had clearly been mended more than once, with light brown hair pulled back beneath a simple bonnet and eyes the color of the sea she had left behind. She paused at the top of the steps, scanning the platform, and Nathaniel felt every eye in that crowd shift from her to him and back again, waiting the way people wait for something to go wrong so they can say they saw it coming. Sarah Whitmore's gaze found him. He watched her take in the scars, the twisted line of his mouth, the puckered skin along his jaw, and he braced himself the way he had braced himself 1,000 times before, for the flinch, the averted eyes, the polite excuse. But she did not flinch. She stepped down from the train, walked the length of that platform with her traveling case in hand, stopped in front of him, and looked directly into his face with an open, searching honesty that no one in Millbrook Hollow had offered him in over a decade. Then she said that he looked exactly like the kind of man who wrote honest letters, and that she was glad to finally meet him. The crowd on that platform went very quiet, and Nathaniel Cross, a man who had not cried since the night of the fire, felt his throat tighten in a way he had not expected and could not entirely explain. He drove her back to the house behind the forge in his wagon, the two of them mostly silent, both aware of the enormity of what they had just done, marrying a stranger, building a life on the foundation of a handful of letters and a shared willingness to hope. The house was small but sturdy, a home Nathaniel had built with the same hands that shaped iron, and Sarah walked through its rooms that first evening with a quiet, appraising warmth that told him she saw not what was lacking, but what could be made of it. That night, they were married by the town's minister, a brief, plain ceremony witnessed by Martha and her husband and a handful of curious townsfolk who had come, Nathaniel suspected, more to see whether the wedding would actually happen than out of any real goodwill. Sarah stood beside him in her one good dress and said her vows in a clear, steady voice, and when the minister told Nathaniel he could kiss his bride, he hesitated, uncertain, until Sarah herself closed the distance between them, rose slightly on her toes, and kissed the scarred corner of his mouth as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The early weeks of their marriage were not without difficulty. Sarah had left behind everything she knew, and there were nights Nathaniel heard her crying softly in the room they now shared, grieving a mother, a coastline, a life that no longer existed for her. He did not know, at first, how to comfort her, unaccustomed as he was to being needed in that particular way, and there were mornings he retreated to the forge before dawn simply because he did not trust himself to say the right thing. But Sarah never once complained about the scars, never once asked him to cover his face or turn away from her, and slowly, in the space of ordinary days, spent hammering iron and mending fences and cooking simple suppers. Something began to grow between them that neither the fire nor the town's cruel whispers could touch. The town, for its part, did not surrender its prejudices easily. There were women at the church socials who looked at Sarah with a kind of pitying curiosity, as though she were a specimen to be studied, a woman who had either not known better or had settled for less than she deserved. There was a particular afternoon, only a month into their marriage, when Sarah went to the general store to purchase flour and thread, and overheard two women discussing, in low but not low enough voices, how surprised they all were that the blacksmith's bride hadn't yet run off screaming, and wondering how long it would take before she came to her senses. Sarah did not cry in that store. She paid for her flour and her thread with steady hands, walked home along the dusty road with her chin held high, and said nothing of it to Nathaniel that evening, though he could tell, from the particular quality of her silence, that something had wounded her. It was Martha who eventually told him what had happened, having heard it from her own circle of gossip, and Nathaniel felt something in him ignite that he had not felt in years, not sorrow, not shame, but a clean, protective anger on behalf of the woman who had crossed half a continent to stand beside him. He rode into town the next morning, walked into the general store, and though he was not a man given to speeches, he told the shopkeeper and the two women present, plainly and without raising his voice, that his wife had done nothing in her life to deserve their pity, and that any person who had something to say about his marriage was welcome to say it to his face rather than behind his back. The women left the store flustered and silent, and word of what had happened spread through Millbrook Hollow by nightfall, and something in the town's attitude, slowly, imperceptibly, began to shift. The turning point, the moment the whole town's opinion truly began to change, came the following winter, when a blizzard swept down from the mountains and trapped half a dozen travelers, including a young family with two small children, in a stalled wagon on the road just outside of town. Nathaniel was the one who organized the rescue, driving out into the storm with ropes and blankets and lanterns while other men hesitated at their own doorsteps. And it was Sarah who threw open the doors of their home that night, without a single moment's hesitation, to shelter the frozen, frightened family until the storm passed. She fed them from her own kitchen, wrapped the children in her own quilts, and sat up through the night with the mother, a woman named Ruth Callahan, talking softly to keep her calm while the wind howled outside. By morning, when the storm had cleared and the family could safely continue on their way, Ruth Callahan embraced Sarah at the door and told her, in front of half the town who had gathered to check on the travelers, that she had never in her life met a kinder woman, and that whoever had called Sarah's marriage anything but fortunate did not know the first thing about what made a marriage good. That winter marked something of a quiet reckoning in Millbrook Hollow. The family's Nathaniel had shoed horses for over the years, the men whose plows he had mended without complaint even when they could not pay him on time, the widows whose stove hinges he had fixed for free, began, one by one, to speak up in his defense whenever the old cruel talk resurfaced. It is a strange thing about small towns, that the same tongues capable of such casual unkindness are often, eventually, capable of turning that same energy toward loyalty, once they are given a reason to see a person clearly. And slowly, over the following 2 years, Nathaniel Cross stopped being spoken of as the scarred blacksmith no woman would marry, and started being spoken of simply as Nathaniel, husband to Sarah, a good man with a good wife, the two of them building a life and, eventually, a family in the little house behind the forge. Their first child, a daughter they named Hannah, was born in the spring of 1889, and Nathaniel would later say that the moment he held her, tiny and red-faced and furious at the cold air of the world, was the moment he finally understood that the fire which had taken his father and scarred his face had not, in the end, taken his future from him at all. Sarah recovered from the birth slowly, and it was Nathaniel who sat beside her through the long nights that followed, learning to hold his daughter against his scarred cheek, discovering that Hannah, too young to know any better, only ever reached for him with open, trusting hands, never once flinching at the ridged skin beneath her small fingers. There is a particular kind of healing that comes from being loved by someone too young to have learned the world's cruelty yet, and Nathaniel found in his daughter's unguarded affection a peace that 11 years of the town's whispered judgments had never allowed him. By the time Hannah was old enough to toddle around the forge, chasing sparks with wide, delighted eyes while her father worked, and by the time a second child, a son named Josiah, had joined the family, Nathaniel Cross's forge had become something of a gathering place in Millbrook Hollow. Not merely a business but a kind of quiet anchor for the town. Men brought their sons to watch him work, to learn the trade, and more than one father told Nathaniel, in the plain, awkward way frontier men expressed such things, that he hoped his boy would grow up to have half the character Nathaniel had shown, scars and all. Sarah, for her part, became known throughout the county for her kindness, running what amounted to an informal aid society from her kitchen table, organizing meals for new mothers and firewood for widows through the hard winters. And there were more than a few families in Millbrook Hollow who would later say that the Cross household had done more good for that town than any church social ever had. If this story has touched your heart even a little, if it has reminded you that a scar, whether on the face or on the soul, has never once been able to measure the true worth of a person's heart, I would ask you to take just a moment right now to like this video and to share it with someone in your life who might need to hear tonight that it is never too late for kindness to find its way home. Your support means more to this channel than you know, and it helps stories like Nathaniel and Sarah's reach the people who need them most. Before I bring this story to its close, I want to ask you something, and I would love to hear your honest answer in the comments below. Have you ever misjudged someone by the way they looked, only to discover later just how wrong you had been? Or have you ever been the one misjudged, waiting patiently for someone to finally see past the surface to who you truly are underneath? Please, take a moment and share your story in the comments. I read every single one, and I promise you, your words matter more than you know. Nathaniel Cross lived the remainder of his years in Millbrook Hollow, watching his children grow, watching the forge he had rebuilt from ashes pass eventually into the capable hands of his son, and watching the town that had once written him off entirely come to regard him as one of its most respected men. He never stopped bearing his scars, of course. There was no undoing what the fire had done to his face all those years before, but he stopped, somewhere in those years beside Sarah, carrying the scars as a burden, and began instead to carry them simply as a part of the story of a man who had been given, against every expectation, a second chance at love. He would tell his children, when they were old enough to understand, that the town had been wrong about a great many things over the years, but that they had been wrong about nothing quite so completely as they had been wrong about him, and that the woman who proved them wrong had done it not with grand gestures, but with the simple, steady decision to look at a stranger's honest letter and choose to believe in the heart behind it rather than fear the face she had not yet seen. Sarah Whitmore Cross would often say in her later years that she had come to Montana expecting nothing more than security and a fresh start, and had found instead the truest love of her life in a man the whole world had told her to be afraid of. She said that the greatest lesson of her marriage was not that love conquers scars, though it certainly can, but that love was never really about the face at all, and had always, from the very first letter, been about the honesty and the courage it takes for two frightened, lonely people to trust each other with the truth of who they are. Millbrook Hollow, in time, came to tell the story of Nathaniel and Sarah Cross not as a cautionary tale of a woman who had settled, but as a kind of local legend of what could happen when a person chose kindness over cruelty and courage over comfortable assumption. And it became, for generations of that small Montana town, a quiet, enduring reminder that no one, however scarred, however overlooked, however written off by the whispers of others, is ever truly beyond the reach of love.